They tried to evict me from my own lake cabin, without knowing I owned the entire subdivision they stood on. I didn't plan on starting a war that morning, but when the HOA convoy rolled up my gravel drive waving forged maps and an eviction notice, something felt wrong. Real wrong. The deeper I dug, the uglier it got. Fake boundaries, secret permits, and a plan to claim my lake like I'd never been here at all. So I did what any stubborn ranch-raised engineer would do. I followed the paper trail straight to the truth. If you've ever stood your ground against folks who pushed too far, stick around and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next fight for justice out here. Morning on Pine Hollow Lake always carried a kind of quiet that didn't belong to the world anymore. The water barely moved, holding the reflection of the mountains like it was afraid to disturb them. My cabin, old timber, metal roof, porch that creaked in winter, sat right where the land dipped into a pocket of trees. Most days it felt like the whole place breathed with me. That morning, I was standing knee-deep off the dock, easing a trout off my line. The sunlight was soft and gold, not yet harsh enough to sting the water's surface. I cupped the fish in my palms for a moment. Its scales shimmered like polished coin edges. "Easy now," I murmured, lowering it into the lake. It kicked free with a silver streak and vanished into the dark. Just as I straightened, gravel crackled behind me. Too heavy, too purposeful to be a neighbor dropping by. I turned, and the quiet of the morning snapped like a twig. 3 SUVs rolled up my drive in a tight column, dust swirling behind them. The first one, a spotless white Lexus, stopped hard enough to send pebbles skittering. The door flew open before the engine even cut. Out stepped Bethany Reed, president of the Pine Hollow Shores HOA, self-appointed tyrant of the lakeshore, and a woman who never once set foot on this side of the property line unless she planned to ruin someone's day. She wore a tailored pink blazer that didn't match the wilderness, sunglasses as wide as horse blinders, and a frown carved deep enough to split granite. Behind her climbed out 2 board members I barely recognized, clipboard types, always craning their necks over other people's fences. Bethany didn't bother with hello. She marched toward me like she owned the ground under her shoes. "Mr. Cole, we need to speak immediately." I wiped my wet hands on my jeans, still standing on the dock in rubber waders. "Morning to you too, Bethany. Something wrong? Grass too green? Cabin too rustic? Fish too fishy?" She didn't blink. Humor died somewhere around the time she laminated her first HOA rules packet. "You are in violation of 14 Pine Hollow Shores community codes." She said it like a judge passing sentence. "Your dock is non-compliant. Your cabin exceeds aesthetic standards. Your shoreline maintenance is visually disruptive, and your trash receptacle color is unacceptable." I stared at her. "Trash receptacle color? And," she added sharply, "you have ignored multiple written notices. This is your final warning before eviction proceedings begin." That pulled me up short. Eviction? From my own cabin? I stepped off the dock, boots sinking into wet dirt. Bethany snapped her fingers, and one of her board members handed her an overstuffed manila packet. She held it out like a sheriff serving a warrant. "You signed the Pine Hollow Shores covenants when you purchased this property, Mr. Cole. You are inside HOA boundaries. You are subject to all regulations, effective immediately. This notice sets your eviction date." I felt irritation rise like heat up my neck. "Bethany, I've owned this land for years. I never signed a covenant. I'm not even in your subdivision." She lifted her chin, confidence dripping like oil. "Our records say otherwise." I took the packet from her, flipping it open with wet fingers. Inside were photographs of my cabin, my home, marked with red digital circles, bold violation codes, and a boundary map I'd never seen. The map looked wrong the second my eyes hit it. Lines too straight. Dates too recent. My property drawn inside a block I knew didn't exist when Curtis sold me the place. But none of that prepared me for the final page. slipped behind all the threats, printed in dark lettering. Eviction date, 10 days from notice. The morning breeze stilled. Even the lake seemed to stop breathing. Bethany crossed her arms, satisfied. You have been officially served. I looked back at the paper, then at her, standing on my gravel, on my land, with her 2 board members lined up like backup singers. My irritation turned into something colder, sharper. Because deep down, even before I understood the how or the why, one thing was already clear. Something about this eviction didn't just feel wrong. It felt impossible. And yet, there it was. 10 days to leave the place I'd poured years into. The cabin Curtis Weller swore could never be touched by an HOA. The place that sat on land older than Pine Hollow Shores ever dreamed of being. I closed the packet slowly, the paper crackling in my grip. Bethany, I said, voice low, you just made a mistake. She smirked, thinking I meant the paperwork. But I wasn't talking about paperwork. I was talking about waking up a man who knew this lake better than any map she could forge. A man who still had the original deed tucked in a leather binder inside the cabin. A deed she had never seen. A deed she should have feared. As I stepped toward the porch, packet in hand, the lake wind picked up, cool and certain. And for the first time that morning, I wasn't thinking about trout or coffee. I was thinking, what exactly did they think they owned? The question followed me up the porch steps like a shadow. My boots thudded against old pine planks worn smooth by years of Wyoming summers and winters. The morning air carried that cool lake smell, wet earth, cold stone, the faint sweetness of pine sap warming in the sun. It should have been peaceful. Instead, every board under my feet felt like it was bracing for impact. Inside, the cabin held its usual quiet, the kind that settles deep into the logs after decades of standing through storms. I set the packet on the kitchen table, the thick paper landing with a slap that echoed off the walls. Sunlight poured through the window, laying warm stripes across the pages like the world was trying to soften their sting. I flipped them open again. 14 violations. 14. I read each one slowly, hoping that somehow the words would shift into something logical. Non-regulation dock. The dock had been here since before I was born. Curtis built it with his father. The beams were old-growth timber you couldn't buy anymore. Unapproved structural expansion. The cabin hadn't changed an inch since the day I moved in. Trash receptacle color non-compliant with subsection 3B. The bin was forest green, the exact color you'd want in the woods. Then, the one that made my jaw lock. Unauthorized occupation of HOA-controlled land. I sat down hard. Nothing in the world had changed between yesterday and today. But suddenly, a group of people in matching polos believed they owned my shoreline, my dock, my cabin, my life. And the more I stared at the boundary map they'd included, the more wrong it felt. The lines looked manufactured. Clean digital strokes cutting across land I'd walked 1,000 times. No contour markers. No survey stamps. Just a pretty shape drawn around my cabin like someone lassoed it in Microsoft Paint. The date in the corner read 2022. The genuine county map I'd seen when I bought the place was from 1950. You didn't just update a map like that without paperwork, hearings, legal filings, none of which I had ever seen. I rubbed my forehead, trying to slow the pulse beating there. Bethany's voice replayed in my mind. You signed the covenants. You're inside HOA boundaries. This is your final notice before eviction. A hollow laugh escaped me. Curtis would have spit his coffee if he heard that woman say she owned anything on this side of the pines. He told me once, sitting right on this porch while the sun dipped behind the ridge, "Don't let suits tell you about your own land, Remy. This ground remembers who it belongs to." My gaze drifted to the old wooden drawer beside the stove, the one with the squeaky hinge and the faint smell of cedar dust. The deed lived in there, wrapped in leather, tied with a string, older than any of the people who tried to take my lake. I walked over, opened it, and pulled out the binder. The cover creaked as I untied the string. Inside lay documents yellowed by time, pages typed on a machine whose letters occasionally hit too hard or too soft, land surveys with ink that feathered at the edges, handwritten notes from Curtis's father, meticulous, dated, signed. I flipped to the deed. Parcel origin, 1950. Owner, Samuel Weller transferred to Curtis Weller transferred to Remy Cole. Land. Status, private, unsubdivided, long-term leaseholds attached. Everything crisp, everything legitimate, everything older than the HOA by half a century. And then I remembered Curtis handing it to me on the day I bought the cabin. His hands were shaking with age, but his voice was steady. You take care of this lake, Remy, and don't let anyone sell you a story that doesn't line up with what's on this paper. I set the binder beside the eviction packet. Two worlds sat on my table. The real one, inked by men who built this land with their hands, and the counterfeit one, printed by people who didn't know a dock beam from a dining bench. A low rumble outside broke my focus. Another SUV rolled up the drive. I stepped onto the porch expecting Bethany again, but it was only the mail carrier, an older man, hat pulled low, bag slung over his shoulder. He waved. Morning, Remy. Got something for you. He handed me a thin white envelope, no return address, only to Resident Pine Hollow Shores. What's this? I asked. He shrugged. Been getting a lot of these lately. HOA newsletter or something. I opened it. Inside was a one-page notice. Effective immediately, Pine Hollow Shores HOA has expanded boundary jurisdiction to ensure unified community standards. All adjacent lakefront properties are hereby subject to oversight. Signed, Bethany Reed, President. My stomach tightened. They weren't just pushing paperwork. They were expanding borders, redrawing lines, acting like they had power no one ever gave them. But the worst part came at the bottom. Failure to comply will result in removal by community enforcement. Community enforcement, not law enforcement, not state enforcement, not federal authority. Just neighbors with clipboards and inflated egos who believed they could police a man off land he legally owned. I felt a pulse of heat travel up my spine. This wasn't just overreach. It was a takeover attempt. The quiet lake morning was long gone. The air felt heavier now, thicker, like a storm gathering behind the ridge. The breeze stirred the porch railing, making the old wood groan. Something was coming, and it wasn't the afternoon wind. I gathered the eviction packet, the fake map, the boundary notice, and the old leather deed. I pressed them together until my knuckles turned white. Then I said it out loud, letting the words settle into the cabin walls. If they think they own this land, they have no idea what they're stepping into. I grabbed my truck keys off the hook. It was time to call Sarah. As I reached for the door, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Mr. Cole, this is urgent. Please contact us immediately regarding Pine Hollow Shores enforcement actions. Enforcement. That word again. And suddenly, the eviction wasn't the scariest part anymore. Enforcement. A thin little word, printed in cheap ink, but it hit with the weight of a steel gate slamming shut. I turned the phone over in my hand, the message staring back at me like a threat dressed up as a courtesy. The wind picked up across the lake, pushing a cold ripple toward shore. A few loose pine needles skittered across the porch, tapping against the boards like impatient fingers. I locked the door behind me and stepped toward my truck, feeling that old familiar tightness behind the ribs. the kind that shows up when trouble pretends it has authority. The gravel crunched under my boots as I climbed into the cab. Dust rose behind the tires as I backed out onto the narrow road that wound through the pines. The trees leaned in overhead, their tall shadows draped across the hood. The lake disappeared behind me, swallowed by the curves of land that had been untouched for generations. I pulled my phone from the dash mount and hit the contact I knew by heart. Sarah Mitchell picked up on the second ring. "Remy? What's going on? You sound like you swallowed a porcupine." I exhaled. "Sarah, the HOA rolled in this morning. 3 SUVs, they're trying to evict me." There was a pause, not the confused kind, the angry kind. "They can't evict you. You're not under their jurisdiction." "According to them, I am now." I steered through the bend, the tires thumping over a patch of exposed roots. They gave me 14 violations, claimed I signed covenants. They handed me a boundary map with my cabin drawn inside their subdivision. Her voice sharpened. "A new map?" "Brand new, too clean, too perfect." I hesitated, remembering the wrongness of those lines. And I got a letter in the mail saying they extended jurisdiction to adjacent lakefront properties. Silence again. Then, "Oh, that's bad. That's very bad." "I saved the worst for last," I added. They used the word enforcement twice. Sarah cursed under her breath. Quiet, clipped, controlled. The attorney version of panic. "Remy, listen carefully," she said. "This is not normal HOA behavior. Expanding jurisdiction without a vote? That's illegal. Evicting someone outside their boundaries? Also illegal. Redrawing maps without county approval? That's fraud." I kept driving, the forest thinning as I approached the ridge. "It gets worse, I see. The map contradicts the deed. Curtis's father never subdivided the land." I checked. Another sharp inhale from her side. "Pull over, now." I eased the truck onto a dirt turnout overlooking a wide valley. The wind out here carried the smell of sagebrush and the distant hint of rain. I turned off the engine. The silence felt like a held breath. "Okay," I said. "I'm pulled over." "Remy," she said slowly, "if the Weller family never subdivided and your deed includes leasehold rights beyond the cabin footprint, the HOA may be sitting on land they don't legally own." I stared straight ahead at the open valley. "Say that again." "You might own the entire tract beneath Pine Hollow shores." A bird screeched somewhere overhead, circling in the wide blue. "That can't be real," I said softly. "It's rare," she replied, "but not impossible, especially in older ranching areas. If Curtis's father leased the lots instead of subdividing them, and those leases never expired, you bought all of it when you bought the cabin." The leather-bound deed flashed in my mind. Its yellowed pages, the worn signatures, the words long-term leaseholds attached. That phrase I'd always skimmed over, assuming it meant backyard rights or access paths. I never imagined it could be something bigger. "You need to bring me every document you have," Sarah said. "The deed, surveys, any letters from the HOA. I need to look at all of it." "I'm on my way," I said. "Good. And Remy?" Her voice softened, but only barely. "Don't talk to them again without me. Not until we know exactly what they've stepped into." I hung up and sat there for a moment, staring out through the windshield. A storm cloud was forming over the ridge, dark and heavy, dragging its shadow across the valley floor. The wind picked up, rattling the truck's mirror. The world had shifted today. Not violently, not loudly, but with the quiet force of a fault line settling beneath your home. And now every step forward felt like dangerous ground. I started the engine again and headed toward town, the pines bending with the growing wind. The road narrowed through a canyon, the sunlight breaking into fractured beams across the hood. My mind raced ahead of the tires. If Sarah was right, if the HOA built their kingdom on land they didn't own, then Bethany Reed wasn't just wrong. She was trespassing. And every fine, every threat, every piece of paper she shoved under someone's door was standing on stolen ground. As I reached the outskirts of town, dust trailing behind me, my phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. This time I answered. A clipped voice said, "Mr. Cole, this is Pine Hollow Shores Enforcement Division. You have failed to respond to urgent notices. We require immediate access to your property for inspection. Refusal to comply will result in escalation." The road curved sharply, but for a moment I forgot to steer. "Who is this?" I demanded. But the line went dead. I gripped the wheel, knuckles white, heart hammering. That wasn't a neighbor. That wasn't a volunteer. That wasn't some clerk with a clipboard. That was someone pretending they had authority on land they had never owned. And suddenly, the boundary dispute wasn't just a mistake or a power grab. It felt like the first warning shot of something much bigger. As I pulled into town, storm clouds rolling in behind me, one question burned louder than the rest. What exactly was Pine Hollow Shores trying to build on my land? The quiet little main street of Pine Bend sat under a sky turning the color of tarnished steel. Porch flags flattened against storefronts in the rising wind. A few folks looked up as my truck rolled past, nodding, then looking again, like they sensed something was wrong simply by how fast I was driving. I parked in front of Sarah's office, a narrow red brick building tucked between the feed store and the post office. The doorbell jingled when I stepped inside. The scent of old books, printer paper, and pine cleaner mixed in the air. Sarah stood behind her desk, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back, a stack of legal binders open in front of her. She took one look at my face and shut everything she was doing. "Show me," she said. I dropped the packet, the boundary notice, and the deed onto her desk. The storm outside pressed against the windows as the first drops of rain tapped the glass. Sarah spread the documents out. Her brows lowered immediately. "Let's start with the obvious," she muttered, sliding the fake map beside the deed's original survey. "These aren't just different. They're from different centuries. Look here." She tapped the corner of the HOA map. Digital formatting, vector lines, modern typeface. If this were officially filed, I'd know about it. So would the county. She held up the deed. This, on the other hand, is as legitimate as it gets. Survey markers, original plat signatures, county clerk stamps. She pointed at the margin. Filed 1950, updated 1968, updated again in 89. All consistent, all legal. I leaned over the desk. "You're saying the HOA faked an entire subdivision boundary?" She didn't answer right away. She picked up the HOA map again, holding it toward the lamp, eyes narrowing. "Look at the shading. No elevation contours, no hydrology marks, no zoning codes, no initials from independent verification. This isn't a map, Remy. It's a piece of graphic design pretending to be one." My jaw tightened. "And they tried to evict me with it." Her jaw tightened too. "That's not just overreach. That's fraud." The storm cracked outside, lightning flashing across the ceiling. Thunder rolled a second later, rattling the office windows. The fluorescent lights flickered. Sarah dropped into her chair, rubbing her temples. "This is bigger than I thought." I sank into the seat across from her. "Tell me." She pulled another binder toward her. A county record registry. She flipped through pages of property deeds and zoning notes, fingers moving fast. "The Weller land was never subdivided," she said. "Look here. Leasehold assignments. That means the early residents didn't buy the lots. They leased them from the Weller Ranch. When leases expire, the land reverts to the holder of the original title. You." I stared at the pages. "So the HOA has been operating on land it doesn't own." She shut the binder hard. They have no authority to enforce anything on Pine Hollow shores unless you give them jurisdiction, and you haven't. A knock on the office door made us both look up. Marcus Hale stepped in, uniform dusty, hat pushed back like he'd run from his patrol truck. "Sarah? Remy?" He nodded once. His face was grim. "I figured I'd find you two together." "What's wrong?" I asked, though the weight in my stomach already knew. Marcus shut the door behind him. "Got a call this morning. The HOA filed for an emergency eviction hearing with the county judge. They're claiming you're a safety hazard and a non-compliant occupant of HOA-controlled land. They want you removed within 72 hours. Something cold slid through me. "They're escalating?" "Oh, they're not just escalating." Marcus crossed his arms. "Word around the sheriff's office is Bethany's been planning something involving the lake. Some kind of development push." Sarah shot up from her chair. "Development?" Marcus nodded. "Heard her talking in the diner last week. Something about an opportunity and shoreline optimization." I felt heat crawl up the back of my neck. Optimization. That's the kind of word you use when you want to tear something down. Sarah grabbed the fake map again. "Remy, what if this isn't just about your cabin? What if this is about the lakefront, about claiming control so they can build whatever they want?" Marcus lowered his voice. "You're not the only one they've targeted. A few folks came to me complaining about fines, strange warnings, threats to remove their docks, mostly older residents." My grip tightened on the armrest. "They're trying to take the whole shoreline. And if they get away with it," Sarah said quietly, "your land becomes their development." Lightning flashed again, throwing stark shadows across the office. Sarah exhaled sharply. "We need to get ahead of this. You need to bring me every scrap of paperwork, every letter, every photo, and Remy," she pointed at the fake map, "this needs to go before a judge." Marcus stepped closer. "And you're not going back to the cabin alone tonight. If they sent an enforcement message, someone's stirring trouble." I nodded slowly. The reality of it settled over me like a heavy coat. My quiet lake life wasn't quiet anymore, and the storm pounding the windows felt like an echo of what was coming. Sarah packed the documents into a thick file. "We file a motion first thing in the morning. Fraudulent boundaries, illegal jurisdiction. We'll challenge everything." "And if they show up before then?" I asked. Marcus adjusted his duty belt. "Then they'll run into me." Thunder boomed again, louder this time, like a warning shot across the valley. Sarah met my eyes. "Remy, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is an organized land grab." I swallowed hard. The storm outside lashed against the glass, but inside everything was suddenly sharper, clearer. The eviction wasn't the fight. The boundary wasn't the fight. The real battle was something much bigger. And as I gathered the papers and followed Marcus into the rain-soaked evening, one truth settled into my bones. They thought they could take my lake, but they had no idea what they'd awakened. By sunrise the next morning, the storm had blown off toward the mountains, leaving behind a cold stillness that felt heavier than the rain. The air smelled of wet pine and iron-rich dirt. A thin mist sat over Pine Hollow Lake like it didn't want to let go of the night. I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of timber in the wind made me sit upright, half expecting to see headlights crawling up the gravel again. At 7 sharp, Sarah pulled into my drive in her silver Tacoma. She stepped out with a travel mug steaming in one hand and a thick binder tucked under her arm. My documents, her notes, all the ammunition we had. Marcus followed in his cruiser, parking nose first like he expected trouble. "Ready?" Sarah asked. "As I'll ever be." We drove in silence toward the county courthouse. The road wound between dark pines dripping with last night's rain. The tires hissed on wet asphalt. The rising sun cast pale light through the branches, turning everything a muted gold. But the closer we got to town, the thicker my thoughts became, every mile tightening like a rope being pulled from both ends. When we pulled into the courthouse lot, I saw them immediately. 3 HOA SUVs, parked crooked, engines still warm, and Bethany Reed standing at the top of the courthouse steps like she was posing for a magazine about terrible people. Pink blazer freshly pressed, hair sculpted, face tight with the smugness of someone who believes she's already won. Beside her, Jake Mercer, HOA treasurer, nervous, eyes darting. Paula Ridge, HOA secretary, holding a clipboard like a shield, and 2 others I didn't recognize but instantly disliked. As soon as I stepped out of the truck, Bethany turned to her entourage and whispered something. They all looked down at me like I was a trespassing animal, wandering somewhere I didn't belong. Sarah leaned toward me. Whatever happens inside, keep your calm. Let them talk first. Trust me. We walked up the steps. Bethany blocked the door. "Mr. Cole," she said, smiling just enough to show teeth. "I hope you brought an overnight bag. You may not be going home today." "Bethany," I replied, "if you spent half as much energy checking facts as you do issuing threats, you wouldn't be here." Her smile faltered. She stepped aside, letting us pass only because the bailiff opened the door from inside. The courtroom was cold, the kind that sinks into your bones. Wooden benches, high ceilings, a faint echo with every footstep. Judge Ramirez sat already in her seat, mid-50s, sharp eyes, the kind of person who smelled lies before they were spoken. She shuffled some papers as we took our places. "Calling the matter of Pine Hollow Shores HOA versus Mr. Remy Cole," she announced. "Arguments regarding emergency eviction." Bethany stood immediately, as if she'd been rehearsing all night. "Your Honor," she began, "this is a clear case of a resident refusing to comply with community standards. 14 violations, ignoring written notices, unsafe modifications to a shared shoreline, non-compliant dock construction, unauthorized structures," Sarah whispered to me. "Let her bury herself." Bethany continued her monologue, pacing like she owned the courtroom. "This resident," she motioned toward me, "poses a threat to the uniform appearance and safety of Pine Hollow Shores. Our board unanimously voted for eviction due to his refusal to follow the covenants he signed when entering our community." I didn't move, didn't blink, but my jaw tightened. She flipped open a 3-ring binder full of glossy photos. My cabin, my dock, my trash bin, even a close-up shot of the porch boards where a knot in the wood had darkened from sun and rain. "Furthermore," she said, "our recently updated boundary map clearly places Mr. Cole's cabin within HOA jurisdiction. Exhibit G." She held up the fake map like it was gospel. A murmur ran through the room. It felt like the air thickened. Bethany wasn't done. "One more point, Your Honor," she said with a smug tilt of her chin. "We have reason to believe he is harboring unregulated wildlife attractants on his property." She nodded toward the photo of my fishing gear. The judge raised an eyebrow. "He fishes on a lake." Bethany gulped. "Yes. Well, that too is prohibited by community vote. The lake must remain pristine." Judge Ramirez tapped her pen twice, her version of irritation. "Thank you, Ms. Reed," the judge said flatly. "You may sit." Bethany sat with the victory smirk of someone who believed the gavel was already halfway down. Then the judge turned her gaze to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell," she said. "Your response?" Sarah rose slowly, smoothing the binder in front of her like she was straightening the feathers of a hawk about to strike. "Your Honor," she began calmly, "my client is not only innocent of every allegation, he is not, nor has he ever been, under the jurisdiction of the Pine Hollow Shores HOA." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Sarah continued, voice steady, cutting. The boundary map submitted by the HOA is not a county-recorded document. It lacks elevation contours, official seals, survey signatures, and legal filing dates. In short, it is a forgery. Bethany stiffened. Jake Mercer wiped sweat from his forehead. Sarah opened the binder and laid down the original deed, carefully, reverently, like she was placing a stone tablet before the court. "This," she said, "is the official Weller Ranch deed, filed in 1950. Updated consistently over decades, it proves Mr. Cole owns private land that predates Pine Hollow Shores by more than 60 years. She slid the forged map beside it. "And this," she tapped it once, "is a fabricated boundary manufactured to seize control of property they do not own." Even the judge leaned forward. Sarah didn't stop. "The HOA has no authority over Mr. Cole's land. They cannot evict him. They cannot fine him. They cannot rewrite boundaries. And they certainly cannot threaten him with something called community enforcement." The room went dead silent. Then Sarah delivered the line that cracked everything open. "Your Honor, this is not an eviction case. This is a case of attempted unlawful jurisdiction, boundary fraud, and misuse of HOA power." The judge looked at Bethany, hard. Bethany's confidence bled out of her face. For the first time since the hearing started, she looked scared. Judge Ramirez lifted the original deed, studied the signature line, and raised her eyebrows slowly, deliberately, before saying, "Ms. Reed, did you or any member of the Pine Hollow Shores Board verify land ownership before enforcing your covenants?" And Bethany had no answer. Her mouth opened, then closed again, like a fish gasping on a dock. A crack formed in her polished composure, spreading beneath the surface like a hairline fracture in porcelain. Jake Mercer shifted in his seat. Paula stared down at her clipboard, as if it might burst into flames. The silence in that courtroom was thick enough to feel. Even the hum of the ceiling lights seemed to fade. Judge Ramirez tapped the corner of the deed with her pen. "This document predates your HOA by decades," she said. 63 years, to be exact. Bethany straightened abruptly, grasping for footing. "Your Honor, everyone signs the covenants when they move in. It's standard procedure." "And yet," the judge said, sliding the original deed back in front of her, "Mr. Cole did not sign, nor is his parcel listed in any subdivision records. Nor did your HOA confirm land ownership." She paused. "Miss Reed, that is negligence at best. Fraud at worst." Bethany flinched like the word struck her physically. Sarah remained perfectly calm beside me, hands folded, expression carved from stone. Meanwhile, my heart thumped so hard that I could feel it pulse behind my ribs. I wasn't used to sitting in rooms where truth suddenly became heavier than any hammer. The judge looked at the fake map again. Then she frowned. "And there's something else." She leaned down, pulled a magnifier from her drawer, and examined the corner of the HOA map. After a moment, she held it up. "This map," she said, "contains a watermark from a graphic design platform. Not a county survey, not a civil engineering firm, a website." The courtroom reacted with an audible shift of chairs and murmurs. Sarah didn't smile, but her eyes did. The judge turned sharply to Bethany. "Ms. Reed, did you create this document?" Bethany's face flushed red. "Absolutely not," she sputtered. Our board handles documentation. I oversee." "So you submitted a boundary revision to this court without verifying its authenticity?" The judge cut in. Bethany swallowed hard. "We believed it was accurate." "Believed," the judge repeated, "not confirmed." She tapped her pen again, this time with finality. "Ms. Mitchell, continue." Sarah stood smoothly. "Your Honor, the forged map is only one part of the problem. Mr. Cole has received multiple notices threatening community enforcement, a term not recognized by law." The judge nodded. "I am aware." "Additionally, Sarah continued. Mr. Cole received a letter claiming the HOA expanded jurisdiction to include adjacent lakefront properties. No such expansion was filed with the county. Pine Hollow Shores has no legal authority beyond its original subdivision boundaries. Sarah laid down another document, my deed's supplemental notes. Furthermore, she said, her voice rising just a notch, the Weller land grant includes a non-transferable leasehold system, meaning no land was sold, only leased, and those leases are still active, which means… The judge raised a hand. I understand. Mr. Cole owns the underlying land. A ripple of breath left my lungs. Bethany choked on air. That's absurd, she hissed. He owns one cabin, one! He can't own the entire subdivision. Judge Ramirez lifted the deed again. Legally, he does. Bethany stumbled backward into her seat, gripping the armrest like it might save her from sinking. Jake Mercer whispered something to her, something shaky, but she didn't respond. The judge turned her attention to the HOA binder Bethany had brought. She opened it, flipping through pages of photos of my cabin, my dock, even my garbage bin. She studied each picture for a moment before closing the binder with a sharp thud. Ms. Reed, she said, your eviction petition is based entirely on unverified documents and authority you do not possess. Her voice echoed through the room, calm but carrying the force of a gavel itself. Then she looked directly at me. Mr. Cole, this court acknowledges your legal ownership of the land beneath Pine Hollow Shores. My breath hitched. Hearing it said out loud, official, final, court-recorded, felt like the air around me had shifted. But the judge wasn't done. This court also recognizes that the Pine Hollow Shores HOA has overstepped its jurisdiction, submitted falsified documents, and attempted unlawful eviction. Gasps filled the room. One man in the back muttered, "Knew it," under his breath. And therefore, Judge Ramirez continued, their actions today will be reviewed under the lens of potential civil fraud. Bethany's hands trembled. Sarah looked at me from the corner of her eye, silent, steady, victorious. But then the judge reached for another file, one we hadn't brought. This, she said, sliding it forward, was submitted to this court earlier this morning. I leaned forward. What is that? I whispered. Something very concerning, the judge said. She opened the file and revealed a printed copy of a permit request, a development permit, large print header, HOA letterhead, signed by Bethany Reed. I felt my stomach drop. Sarah stiffened beside me. Judge Ramirez cleared her throat. According to this document, the Pine Hollow Shores HOA is seeking approval to build a private marina along Pine Hollow Lake. The courtroom erupted. The judge raised her voice. Order! Bethany tried to stand, but stumbled instead. Your Honor, I didn't submit that. But Judge Ramirez wasn't looking at her. She was looking at me. And Mr. Cole, she said, this permit lists the proposed construction site as your shoreline. The pencil in my hand snapped clean in two. Every sound in the room blurred into a distant hum. The judge closed the folder. We aren't finished, but we have enough here to halt all HOA actions pending further investigation. Her voice softened, but only slightly. Mr. Cole, I strongly suggest preparing for the likelihood that this HOA intended more than eviction. As the gavel fell, Sarah leaned toward me and whispered, barely audible, Remy, they weren't trying to take your cabin. They were trying to take your lake. Sarah's whisper echoed in my head long after the gavel fell. The courtroom emptied around us, voices rising like uneasy waves as people filed through the double doors. Some stared at me with wide-eyed surprise. Some nodded in quiet support. But most wore the same expression, the look of folks who suddenly realized they'd been living under the thumb of something much darker than an HOA with a clipboard complex. I stayed seated for a long moment, elbows on my knees, the remnants of the snapped pencil still in my fist. The wood dug into my palm, grounding me. The storm outside had passed, but inside me, a new one was coming to life. Sarah placed the marina permit in front of me. Look at the bottom. I scanned the page. The words blurred for a second before tightening into a razor. Authorized access. Pine Hollow Shores. HOA. Parcel status. Vacant development. Land property IDs. 12 to 4117, 12-418, 12-419. Parcel 12-417 was mine. The cabin, the dock, the land my father's ashes were scattered on. And the other two? I knew those numbers. They belonged to the Thompsons, a retired couple who'd lived on the lake longer than anyone, and to Earl Dawson, a Vietnam vet who didn't deserve one more fight in his life. My chest tightened. They were going to bulldoze all three. Sarah nodded grimly. Build a private marina. Probably charge access fees. Maybe even sell slips. Do you see the budget projection line? I looked. Projected annual revenue, 1.8 ohm. My stomach dropped. They weren't enforcing rules, I said. They were clearing obstacles. And you, Sarah said, were the biggest obstacle of all. Before I could answer, a shadow fell over the table. It was the judge. She'd come down from the bench, robe still draped across her shoulders, but she'd dropped her stern expression. Her voice was quieter now, almost human. Mr. Cole, she said, there's more. She slid another document onto the table. County seal, permit archive, stamped 6 months earlier. This was filed by the HOA before any of your alleged violations, she said. It claims the lots were already cleared for development. I frowned, but they weren't. That's the problem. The signatures and approvals were forged. Sarah's eyes sharpened like broken glass. Bethany signed them. The judge nodded. There will be a criminal investigation. The air inside that room thickened, as if even the walls were listening. Prepare yourself, the judge said softly. This is not going to be a simple civil matter anymore. She left us with that weight. Marcus appeared in the doorway next, hat in hand, expression darkened with anger he usually kept buried. You saw it? He asked. We saw it, Sarah replied. Marcus rubbed his jaw. Remy, if these permits went through, they were days away from putting survey stakes into your shoreline. I stood, gripping the permit so tightly the edges curled. Not anymore. We walked out of the courthouse into blinding sunlight. The clouds had parted, but the wind remained sharp. The courthouse steps felt steep, like the world had changed between the top and bottom of each one. As we reached the last step, a voice rang out. Hey, Remy! It was Earl. His steel-gray beard and worn flannel jacket made him look like he'd just stepped off a hunting trail. I heard what happened, he said. Bethany came by my place last week, waving papers around. Said I had unauthorized shoreline clutter, my canoe. He shook his head. Said she'd have it removed if I didn't cooperate. My stomach twisted. Earl, you were on the permit list. His eyes narrowed. I figured. She's had a hungry look about my place since last fall. Sarah stepped in. We're going to fight it, but I need everyone Bethany threatened to give statements. Earl slapped my shoulder. You just tell me where to sign. As folks gathered around us, neighbors, weekend fishermen, retirees, the courthouse doors swung open behind us. Bethany emerged, flanked by her attorney and her board cronies. Her face had lost its color. Her steps were faster, clipped, brittle. Every person she passed took a step back from her, not out of fear, but disgust. She tried to keep her head high, but the papers in her hands shook. Jake Mercer trailed behind, wide-eyed and pale. Paula clutched her clipboard, like she needed it to stay upright. When Bethany reached the parking lot, Marcus called out to her. "Ms. Reed." She froze. "This isn't over," she snapped without turning around. "No," Marcus said. "It's just beginning." Her shoulders tensed. She fumbled for her keys. The SUV door slammed so hard the sound echoed across the lot. She sped away without another word. The dust she kicked up drifted across the parking lot like smoke after a fire. Back at my cabin that evening, the lake was calm again. Too calm. Not a ripple disturbed the surface except for the occasional insect skimming across. I stood on the dock, looking at the mountains mirrored in the water. A loon called from somewhere across the lake. A lonely, echoing sound. Behind me, the old cabin door creaked. Sarah stepped onto the porch. "You okay?" she asked. "No," I said honestly, "but I'm ready." She came down the steps. "Tomorrow, we'll gather every document, every neighbor's testimony. Then we file. Fraud, embezzlement, unauthorized land seizure." Her tone hardened. "And we force the county to freeze every HOA action." I nodded slowly. The wind stirred the lake grass along the edge, making it rustle like whispers in the dark. "Remy," Sarah said quietly, "they planned to erase your cabin." I looked down at the dock boards beneath my boots, weathered, cracked, familiar. My father stood here once. Curtis stood here many times. The lake had watched both of them grow old. "They won't erase anything," I said. "Not while I'm alive." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the water. The first stars blinked through the thinning clouds. And somewhere in the distance, an engine hummed along the far side of the lake. Slow, uncertain. A vehicle watching, or waiting. I didn't move. Neither did Sarah. But in that silence, the line between peace and danger felt thinner than it ever had. The engine revved once, deliberately, and then the headlights snapped on, aimed straight across the lake, at my cabin. The beams stretched long across the dark water, pale ribbons slicing through the mist. The lake held them like a still mirror, reflecting the glare right back at us. Sarah stepped closer to my shoulder, the boards creaking beneath her boots. "Remy," she murmured, "that's not a neighbor." "No," I said, jaw tightening. "That's someone checking how far they can push." For a long moment, nothing moved. Just the engine humming low, the headlights carved like a warning. Then, slowly, the SUV backed up the gravel, turned, and disappeared into the trees, its taillights blinking like a predator slipping back into the brush. The night swallowed the sound. The lake went quiet again. Sarah exhaled. "We need to act fast tomorrow." "Tomorrow," I said, "we start pulling back the curtain." Morning came with the smell of damp earth and a sharp breeze carrying the cold bite of the mountains. Sunlight flickered between the pines as the wind bent their tops like bowing silhouettes. I brewed coffee on the old propane stove while Sarah spread our documents across the table. Around 9, a truck engine rumbled in my drive. Then another. Then another. By the time I stepped onto the porch, 7 vehicles lined the gravel. Rusted pickups, old Subarus, and Earl's dented Chevy. Neighbors climbed out, some with folders, some with envelopes, some with years' worth of frustration written across their faces. Earl approached first, holding a thick binder and a thermos of what I hoped wasn't his homemade whiskey. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded. More than ready. Behind him came Tia Marsh, the nurse from across the ridge, holding a stack of printed letters with sticky notes marking dates. She looked tired, like someone who'd fought her battles quietly for too long. "Bethany fined me for having wind chimes," she said. "Said they violated auditory standards. I haven't slept right since." Next came Rena, a single mom whose boy liked to draw chalk dinosaurs on the sidewalk. Her hands trembled as she held out a folder. She called it graffiti, threatened legal action. And then there was George, carrying a spreadsheet printed on paper so thin the ink bled through. "My dues went up 3 times last year," he said. "No vote, no explanation." More neighbors stepped forward, each with a story worse than the last. Fines for porch plants, warnings for non-compliant bird feeders, attempts to order them to cut down healthy trees. Every one of them looked relieved, finally being believed. Sarah sat at a folding table we set up under the pines, pen in hand, glasses perched low on her nose. She listened to each story carefully, her expression tightening as the pile grew taller. "Fraudulent enforcement, fraudulent fines, fraudulent jurisdiction," she muttered. "This is a full pattern." Marcus arrived next, stepping out of his patrol cruiser. He didn't wear his hat this time, just the badge on his belt and a tired look in his eyes. "Word's spreading," he said. "Folks are waking up." He placed his own folder on the table, copies of complaints he'd received over the last year, filed and somehow lost by the HOA's administrative pipeline. The morning air filled with the scent of pine needles crushed under boots, fresh coffee, and the sharp paper smell of old letters pulled from storage boxes. People talked, vented, shook their heads at the absurdity of what they'd endured. And all the while, the stack of evidence grew like a rising tide. At some point, someone asked, "Remy, what now?" I looked at the lake beyond the trees, its still surface broken only by a breeze, carrying soft ripples toward shore. The mountains stood behind it, patient, old, unyielding. "We fight," I said simply. "With truth, with paper, with law." Sarah nodded firmly beside me. "We'll file a motion to suspend the HOA entirely. We already have enough evidence for injunction." "What about the marina?" Earl asked, voice low and rough. Sarah's mouth tightened. "The judge has already flagged it. The county will halt any attempt at development until this is settled. But once we file these affidavits, the weight shifts." The neighbors exchanged glances, relief mixed with anger, and something new, resolve. "Tia," Sarah said, "your letters will help prove harassment." "Rena," she added, "your chalk violation supports the claim of arbitrary enforcement. George, your spreadsheets show financial misconduct." People began lining up to sign sworn statements. Marcus notarized them one by one. Pens scratched, papers flipped. Hands trembled, but signatures were strong. The air buzzed with something powerful. Not rage, not fear. Unity. For the first time in years, Pine Hollow Shores wasn't bowing to Bethany Reed. It was standing taller. By early afternoon, we had 23 affidavits, clear, documented, time-stamped. Sarah stacked them neatly, tapped the edges straight, and said, "Let's deliver these before the clerk's office closes." I gathered the folders. Marcus followed us to the truck. "Keep an eye out," he warned softly. "If Bethany knows you're gathering signatures, she might try something." "She already did," I said. "Last night." Sarah glanced at me. "You think that was her?" "I think it was someone who wanted me to know they were watching." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I'll run patrol past your place tonight." We drove into town. The clerk's office sat beside the courthouse. White siding, metal roof, small American flag out front flapping hard in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of toner and dust. The clerk, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, looked up as we entered. "Filing something?" Sarah placed the stack gently on the counter. "A motion for emergency injunction against Pine Hollow Shores HOA," she said. "And 23 resident affidavits documenting fraudulent fines, forged documents, and unauthorized governance." The clerk's eyebrows rose. "Oh my." She stamped the stack with a heavy thud. "Consider it filed." The sound felt like a hammer sealing something important shut. That evening, Back at the cabin, neighbors lingered on the porch, sharing stories long buried. Someone brought a pot of chili. Someone else brought cornbread. Earl passed around mugs of what turned out to be coffee laced with a hint of something that sure wasn't creamer. The air, which had been tight with fear just a day before, eased into something warmer, lighter hope. But as the last folks trickled back to their homes, the shadows lengthened. The wind off the lake grew colder, and a single question gnawed at the back of my mind. Would the HOA go quiet now that we'd pushed back? Or would they get desperate? As the night settled in, I stepped out onto the porch alone. The lake was dark, the stars reflected in its still surface. No engines, no headlights, no watchers. But peace didn't settle in my chest. Not yet. Because sometime after midnight, the trail camera by my dock clicked, motion detected, and a blurred figure appeared on the screen, walking the shoreline. Chapter 9. The Fall of Pine Hollow Shores. Because sometime after midnight, the trail camera by my dock clicked, motion detected, and a blurred figure appeared on the screen, walking the shoreline. The notification buzzed on my phone. The screen glowed in the dark cabin, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. I sat up slowly, listening. Only the wind moved outside, brushing through the pine needles like a whisper too close to the window. I tapped the video. There it was, grainy night vision green, a person in a dark jacket hood up walking the edge of my property with something in their hand. A clipboard. Flashlight. Maybe both. The figure moved slow, pausing at the dock, peering under the beams as if measuring something. Not a burglar. Not a lost hiker. Someone checking the shoreline. Bethany, I muttered under my breath. Or someone she sent. A second frame captured the figure kneeling, shining a light under the dock planks, like they were looking for weak points. Then the camera caught something that made my blood run cold. A glint of metal. Survey stakes. The same kind used to mark development boundaries. I grabbed my boots, but before heading out, I stopped myself. No. Not like this. Not alone. Not without making sure the law was watching. I forwarded the clip to Marcus and Sarah, then sat at the table waiting for dawn. The minutes stretched long. The lake outside faded from black to silver as the first hint of sunrise cut across the water. By the time I stepped onto the porch, frost clung to the railing. Footprints tracked near the dock, fresh, heading toward the tree line. Whoever had been there wasn't hiding their trail. They were confident. Too confident. A blue sheriff's cruiser rolled into the drive. Marcus stepped out, jaw set, eyes sharp. "You armed?" he asked. "With a cup of bad coffee and 6 hours of no sleep," I said. "Does that count?" He didn't smile. "Show me the camera." We walked down to the dock. The boards groaned under our weight. Mist lifted off the lake in soft curls, turning the whole scene into something between real and dream. Marcus knelt, studying the fresh ground. "Someone was definitely here," he said. "And those impressions." He pointed to 3 faint circles in the mud, tripod legs, survey equipment. A cold knot twisted in my gut. They were mapping the shoreline. "Yep." Marcus stood, brushing his hands off, which is illegal given the injunction we just filed. Sarah arrived next, dressed in a wool coat, binder tucked under one arm. She looked at the footprints, her expression tightening. "That settles it," she said. "They're desperate, and when people get desperate, they get sloppy." The 3 of us stood there, looking out over the quiet water. The lake mirrored the morning sky, pale and cold. But beneath the stillness, something volatile churned, like the lake itself knew what was coming. "We need to move now," Sarah said, "before they make another play." The second hearing was scheduled for noon. By the time we reached the courthouse, the parking lot was full. Residents stood outside in clusters. Muted voices, anxious glances, the weight of months or years of being pushed around pressing into their shoulders. Some carried folders, some carried coffee, some carried nothing but hope. Inside, the courtroom buzzed like a hornet's nest. People lined the walls. Every bench was packed. Even the hallway outside was full. Bethany arrived 10 minutes late. She entered wearing a navy blazer, hair tied tight, a new lawyer in tow, a man who looked like he advertised on interstate billboards, all gelled hair and shiny cufflinks. Behind her were the remaining HOA board members, pale and jumpy, like they knew what was coming. The judge stepped in and the room fell silent. "This court," she began, "has reviewed the evidence submitted regarding Pine Hollow Shores HOA, including witness affidavits, financial discrepancies, and the forged documents presented at the previous hearing." She paused, letting the weight settle. "The fraudulent permit applications alone warrant referral to the district attorney." A wave of whispers swept through the room. "Order," the judge said, tapping her gavel once. She turned to Bethany and her attorney. "Do you have anything to say in your client's defense?" The attorney stood, smoothed his tie, and coughed. "Your Honor, given the mounting evidence, we respectfully request a continue." "Denied," the judge cut in. "This court is ruling today." Bethany's face drained of all color. "Effective immediately," the judge continued, "the Pine Hollow Shores HOA is suspended from all operations pending a full audit." A gasp rippled through the benches. A murmur of relief followed, soft but unmistakable. A few folks wiped their eyes. Paula sank onto her bench, hands trembling as she covered her face. Jake Mercer leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like it might swallow him. Bethany stood. "This is a miscarriage of—" "Sit," the judge commanded. She sat. "And furthermore," the judge added, "a temporary receiver will be appointed to manage community matters until a lawful governing body can be elected." She looked toward me then, straight, steady, not unkind. "And Mr. Cole," she said, "as the legal landholder of the tract beneath Pine Hollow Shores, you are reinstated as custodian of the land agreements. You may proceed to reestablish terms as you see fit." It hit me hard, not as power but as weight, responsibility, history, and the truth Curtis had once told me: this land remembers who owns it. "And finally," the judge said, lifting her gavel, "charges will proceed regarding fraudulent governance, falsified documents, and attempted unlawful seizure of private property." Her gaze locked on Bethany. "Ms. Reed, please stand." Bethany rose, hands tightening on the bench. A bailiff stepped forward. This is—" Bethany sputtered, voice cracking. But the bailiff took her by the arm. Her new lawyer stepped away like he wanted nothing to do with her. The room watched in stunned silence as the queen of Pine Hollow Shores, the woman who once strutted through the neighborhood handing out fines like confetti, was escorted toward the side door. Her steps faltered. Her voice broke. Her eyes were wide, frantic. It was over. Truly over. The gavel fell with a final, echoing strike. Outside the courthouse, as neighbors gathered around me in gratitude, a deputy approached with a sealed envelope, urgent, county-stamped, and said, "Mr. Cole, you're going to want to read this. It concerns the HOA's development plans, and it's worse than we thought." The crowd thinned just enough for me to take a step back. The envelope was thick, stiff, edges sharp like it held something that wasn't meant to see daylight. I tore it open right there on the courthouse steps, the Wyoming wind tugging at the paperwork like it wanted to read it too. Inside was a copy of an application, the kind that had no business being filed without landowner consent. The heading read, "Proposal for Lakefront Redevelopment, Phase 1. My heart dropped as I scanned the text. They weren't just planning a marina. They weren't just planning boat slips. They had submitted plans for a 3-phase development, private docks, a lakeside event center, and, buried halfway down the second page, a request for exclusive water access rights. Exclusive, meaning no resident, no visitor, no fisherman could touch the water without paying them. They planned to take the lake itself. I felt my stomach tighten, but before I could say a word, Sarah stepped beside me and plucked the papers gently from my hand. Her eyes narrowed as she read, jaw tightening, breath steadying. This, she whispered, wasn't just HOA greed. This was a land grab worth millions. Marcus cursed under his breath. And they were going to use you as the first domino. Neighbors around us started asking questions, anxious voices mixing with the courthouse chatter. What is it? What were they trying to do? Is it over? I held up a hand, not to silence them, but to steady myself. It's a map, I said, a map of what they wanted this place to become. Sarah folded the papers carefully, almost solemnly, and tucked them back into the envelope. Remy, she said quietly, this closes the story in court, but it doesn't close it at home. We've still got cleanup. The cleanup didn't happen overnight. It didn't even happen over a week. It took the better part of a month for Pine Hollow Shores to settle into something resembling peace. But that month changed everything. The court-appointed receiver, Lena Morrison, showed up 2 days after the hearing. She was all business. Utility vest, boots dusty from years spent walking construction sites, clipboard that clicked when she wrote. She changed the locks on the HOA center before noon. By evening, she'd frozen every HOA-controlled account. The following morning, she posted a notice. Temporary governance suspended. Structural audit underway. Folks read the sign as if it were scripture. And at the same time, neighbors came out of their houses like the place had been frozen in time and was finally thawing. Tia brought a folder full of fines that had never existed in any bylaw. Rena brought photos of her kids' chalk drawings that had been labeled graffiti. George brought a spreadsheet showing dues increases with no votes. Others brought memories, years of frustration, stories they'd never had the courage to share while Bethany held the reins. Marcus helped them draft statements. Sarah scanned every piece of evidence. And I sat at a wooden table in my cabin with a growing mountain of paperwork that told a story older and deeper than I'd realized. The story of power twisting itself into knots. The story of a community that had been quiet too long. The story of a lake that had been waiting. One night, Lena stopped by the cabin with a USB drive. This has everything the state needs, she said. Financial crimes, forged documents, election fraud, and this. She placed a sheet in front of me. It was the board's internal vote log, except it wasn't. The signatures were copied, printed, pasted. Some were exact duplicates. It wasn't governance. It was theater. They never expected anyone to call their bluff, she said. But you did. I didn't speak. I just nodded and handed her a cup of coffee. A week later, Francesca Bloom, Bethany Reed, whatever name she used, was arrested trying to leave the state under a different identity. Her suitcase was full of cash she'd siphoned off HOA accounts. The community watched the news release together in the general store. Nobody cheered. Nobody gloated. They just exhaled, like someone had been pressing a hand against their chest for years and finally let go. The new council formed slowly, carefully. No power to fine, no power to control. Just neighbors talking to neighbors, deciding how to handle shared spaces. I went to the first meeting, but I didn't sit at the head of anything. I stood in the back with my arms crossed, listening, watching, feeling the room breathe again. Sarah looked over at me once and gave the smallest nod. You did good, it said. Afterward, Earl walked up with a dusty notebook tucked under his arm. Got an idea, he said. We clean up that trail down by the creek. The one nobody's used since the 90s. I grinned. I'll bring the chainsaw. He tapped his hat. It's good to see you stick around. Most folks would have sold the place after what you went through. Most folks, I said, don't own the land their neighbors live on. He smirked at that. Fair enough. Days later, a letter arrived. Official seal, county stamped, crisp as the mountain air. The subdivision's title had been amended. The land beneath Pine Hollow Shores was legally mine, always had been, just buried under paperwork and time. I stood on my dock that evening, the boards warm from the day's sun, the lake glass still beneath a pale orange sky. Pine needles rustled behind me. A loon called somewhere across the water. The world was quiet again. Sarah walked up beside me, leaning against the railing. What'll you do with the subdivision now? Nothing, I said. People need to choose how they live, not get told. She nodded. Curtis would have liked that. I closed my eyes as the sun dipped low. Land doesn't need kings, just caretakers. And Pine Hollow finally had one who understood that. For the first time in a long while, the lake, the land, and the people all felt free and quiet. Exactly the way Wyoming meant them to be. If you've ever stood your ground against folks who pushed too far, drop a simple yes in the comments. Justice only works when good people speak up. And if you want more stories about land, backbone, and getting your rights back the right way, go on and subscribe.